modernism needs to be approached from the historical way of talking about modernism is really starting with something completely different, which is actually was an architectural movement that appeared in the beginning. We can trace back to the beginning of the 20th century, but really developed around what we call the Art Deco period, and it developed from the architecture to the furnitures and design in general, which has nothing to do with modernism as we want to talk about it, but it has to be mentioned for the origin of the term, really. One day I was doing an interview with Tony Klass. Tony Klass was the famous DJ in the mod scene, mod promoter in the 1980s. And I said to him we could even trace modernism back to the Romans, really, because they brought modernism to Europe. But modernism and modernists, as we want to approach the subject, is, as I said before, movement of modern jazz musicians coming from America, mainly New York, I think, led by Miles Davis and a few others at the time, and spread over Europe in the late 50s, early 60s, was quickly replaced by rhythm and blues, which itself had originated rock and roll. Because if you take the first album of Elvis Presley, it's actually only rhythm and blues covers, like Big Mama Thornton and Bobby Bland and all that lot. So that was just to clarify, the term modernism, which can be defined by several movements during the 20th century. Another thing I wanted to point at is the way the media are handling this subject. And most of the time, what I saw on TV was basically a way of making the scene a bit ridiculous and a childish kind of thing. Just because we are driving scooters and we dress a certain way and wear parkas doesn't mean that we all have been stranded in the age of 15 to 17, and it's a bit what the media has been trying to make it look so far. It's a much more serious subject than that. You see nowadays something you never saw before. It's like people in their mid-30s are discovering that scene and joining in, not because they want to be young again, but it gives you some standards, some criteria which are very important in terms of, for instance, the way you look, the way you dress, which are not especially remembered in today's society. For instance, certain type of jackets, certain type of suits were, in my opinion, the apotheose of design back at a certain time. For instance, the three-button jacket with little lapels and all that is something that looks good and looks better than one or two button jackets, which was used before in the 50s or after in the 70s. As I say all the time, I believe that we reached the peak around 66, and then after that it was, well, what are we gonna create? And then came the 70s and the 80s, which was absolutely horrifying in terms of design. I might be wrong, but in my opinion, humanity in the 20th century reached its peak in the early to mid 60s, and things started to degrade shortly afterwards. We could take the hippie fashion as a first start of degradation in a way, although in the very beginning it had some kind of very modish influences. And if you take the first EPs around 63, 65, they pretty much look like American mods. It's only after 67, 68, turning to 69, that things started to degenerate. And that's probably why the skinheads appeared at the same time. Because the skinheads are originally a kind of branch in the mod scene. And it was a reaction against the things where the things were turning out to be for the next decade, basically. So refusal of American influence, although the American influence was primordial before, when during the 60s all music, soul music, R&B and jazz, all that was coming from America. Luckily enough, we had in England an answer to that, came through the Beatles. We are not considered as a mod band, but the Rolling Stones were followed by mods in the beginning because they were a R&B band that turned psychedelic, as everybody knows, throughout the late 60s. Same with The Who, same with the Small Faces. Everybody started to have long hair at a certain point and stopped cutting them, and we could even take Deep Purple as a mod band in a way, although they created a complete different sound. That's it's at the origin of what we call hard rock now. But all of them, if you take David Bowie and John Lord from Deep Purple, who was in a band called Artwood before, which was the brother of Ron Wood, as you know from the Rolling Stones. All that starts in the mod scene, really, in the mid 60s, early to mid 60s. Question me if you have some questions about that.
I have to think about it. Here, well, I'll cut the scene.
We move to another place.
Huh? No, it's okay.
No?
You can do while it's in your mind. Your action.
The commercialization of mod, yeah, is something that is basically killing the scene every time. So it's quite controversial because the mods like to be in numbers. They feel strong in numbers. They became massive around the years of 62, 64. But it's a scene where everybody is an individualist. So when it becomes a movement, well, when it's a movement, it's still okay. Because I make the difference between a movement and a fashion is there. It's basically a movement. Everybody knows each other more or less. And in the mod scene, you've got what we call the faces, so the people who are extremely influential, and the rest is the followers. But in a movement, more or less, everybody knows each other. In a fashion, it's different. It's much more global, and then nobody knows each other. We can recognize each other because of the look. But that's what is, in a way, I think, killing the scene, and has been killing it in the 60s, and has been killing it in the late 70s. Quadrophenia, for instance, the only movie we can say has revived the scene, has also created a national revival, which meant that almost one kid out of two had joined the mod scene back in 78, 79. But in a way, it was killing it because making it extremely commercial. I remember Des Manet telling me that they had created a range of clothes called Quadrophenia, which was pure shitty clothes and stuff that was very badly made. But they tried to catch up. They tried to relaunch it commercially at the time, and it faded away around 82, 84. But what it did, it created a stronger scene. So less people, but much more involved into this cult. And that's when Paul Alam and his Knights as Sneakers, which I mentioned as a big chapter in my first book, showed that the mod scene was probably at its purest stage back in this year's 84, 85. And then it faded away again for different reasons. Because I think that's when Eddie Pilar and a few others started to get into what we call now acid jazz, which was basically enough of the past. Now we want to create a sound that is really mod, but that is new as well. Fairly influenced by soul and funk, as it should be. Then in this case I would have to get back in time and to explain what the music was during the revival period. Basically in 78, 79, a lot of originally punk bands switched to mod, like the Purple Hearts were originally the Sockets and were a punk band. Became a mod band. The Chords as well were massive. Paul Weller and the Jam had originally started with a punk sound, but were vehiculing and transmitting the mod image through their look. So this first part of revival bands, I would say, has nothing much to do with the original mod sound, although they were very much influenced by mod bands. If you listen to the Purple Hearts album, you can spot each song and say, oh, that's the Rolling Stones, oh, that's the Small Faces. But as I would say, to me, only one band back in the time, back in 80 to 85, was able to really recreate a 60s sound, and that was the Prisoners. Then the mod scene kind of split in different directions. On one hand, it became commercial with Tony Class, the promoter and famous DJ. On the other hand, the little bunch of mods called themselves the Untouchables and created a kind of new society at the end of the 80s to offer to the scene an alternative and also a way back to the original sound, something that Paul Alam had tried already in the mid-80s. But the problem was that you grow older, and a lot of people who were involved in that scene of the mid-80s, getting married, having kids, left the scene more or less, and it was replaced by a new generation that created the Untouchables, which was actually, I must say, excellent in the beginning. It was offering a real knowledge in terms of the music, of the looks, but the problem is that throughout the 90s it followed more or less the same road than during the 60s. So it started very smart and very early 60s with a 60s image, and shortly, bit by bit, it moved to the late 60s and the psychedelic period. So by the late 90s, basically, the scene had turned into what was the scene probably around 67, 68, which was totally influenced by the hippie movement, and that's probably what killed it at the end of the century. Then arrived the split between Rob Bailey and the Untouchables, and Rob Bailey did pretty much what Tony Class did in the 80s. He acquired the scene for himself, but in order to stay alive, had to commercialize it suddenly. So it became very much yeah, swinging London scene, shall we say, which is not really modish anymore. You know, the hair growing longer and the suits giving place to the paisley shirts and all that. So now it's difficult to see what is mod and what is not. Uh, Most of the time, somebody who dresses 60s with a 60s style is associated to mod when it was not really the case, let's say 20 years ago. In the 80s, you had the mods and you had the 60s scene, and they were not together. Only back in 80, 81, there was a kind of psychedelic revival inside the mod scene, but that was also a fashion thing that didn't last more than a year. Um,
Where did the when was the first case of mods coming around? Where did they come from?
as I said, they were they apparently were a bunch of young kids, young men, whose parents, whose fathers were tailors in the 50s, and so they started to create their own style, very much influenced by Italy and France for the fashion. Um, and that was created the first modernists apparently in London. Um, if you take the movie, which is not especially well done, Absolute Beginners was released I think in 88, 89 maybe. Um, it shows at some point during a kind of choreography the fight between the traditional rockers and the modernists, happening around 58, 59. It's basically with the booming of the 50s, modernism as as a way of seeing things, as a way of life, had appeared and was wiping out anything in its past. So it was a natural thing, I suppose, to come with the birth of the 60s. Besides, after 5 years, 6 years, rock and roll was kind of running out of steam. So there was a need for the youth to find a new sound, and what they did is they turned to America and looked at what was happening over there. And you had on one hand the modern jazz of the East Coast, which was a revolution in terms of jazz culture, and you had inside the States a very strong influence of black music through rhythm and blues. So instead of looking at the past, which was only 5 or 6 years, which was directly influenced by rock and roll, they thought, well, we're gonna take the latest music that's coming out of America and get to know it a bit more. Now the music, the black music during that period, let's say 58, 66, was absolutely booming over there. It had, let's say, for just the year 66, probably 3,000 bands releasing, you know, singles and records and albums just for that year. So the sound of America came very much to influence the young generations in England. Plus the fact that you had a lot of GIs, American soldiers, that were traveling in and out of Europe still in those days, who were bringing with them lots of records, brand new records, never been heard before. That's how Guy Stevens, for instance, created his label Sue Records, which basically was just bootlegging original stuff coming from America and putting it out in under his label, and that was mainly aimed at mods, you know. Um, Guy Stevens is one of the key personalities who helped to influence the power of that music in this country. So yeah, two influences. I would say originally jazz and then turned into rhythm and blues. But personally, I always was more into jazz. I mean, I can listen to rhythm and blues. I can listen to ska, rock steady. I love these musics, but I will be fed up after a certain time. When as to listen to jazz, I can listen to jazz absolutely all day long and day after day. Which for me, to me, is the original mod music, because in terms of its sophistication, and mod is before anything else a movement that is based on sophistication. It's all about the detail. It's all about the accuracy of your way of dressing and way of behaving and all that. Don't know if that was clear or not.
No,
We'll have
that
to
was
get
good. That's
through.
good.
Story, a little anecdote that has nothing. I mean, that can be mentioned maybe at some point. Is that yeah, when I was 15, 16, and I started to get really interested into music, had no idea what mod was, what it meant. Had never heard of it ever. But very strangely, when I was 12 years old, coming out of school, I had this vision of a guy with a kind of Brian Jones haircut and wearing a parka covered with patches and stuff like that. That was like a vision I had coming out of school. The guy wasn't there, and I had no idea what it meant. It's only like almost 10 years later or 8 years later that I discovered what mod was and how they used to dress up, because well, obviously the parka is always associated with the mod. It's actually the first way to recognize a mod, is because he's wearing an American parka. Saying that, and you can read in my books that very quickly, like for the Eastern Lot, who had been into the scene since 78, by 1980, 81, it was out of question to wear a parka because it makes you look shit, basically. Look like a yobo, as some would say. But then jumping in time, when I was 16, I was pretty much into punk and new wave. And a friend of mine at school said to me one day, are you a mod? Because you dress quite well. You dressed, in suits and so on, although I had some Doc Martens at the feet. And that's the first time I heard of the term, basically, from one guy at school who said, are you a mod because you dress like one? So I suppose it's something that came naturally to me. Although in the beginning I used to hate them. I found them a bit too sectary, shall we say. It's the mods have always played on that image as a sect, as a kind of secret society, a bit like the Masons. And it's no wonder that Smiler calls his book the New Religion, because it appears to a lot as a kind of cult, a religion, in the fact that it's got all its literature, it's got these lines to follow, a bit like early Christianity had created lines to follow.
It is very much like a religion, a way for people to live their lives. Some people get into religion, some people get into politics, football, or mods and rockers. It's all the same sort of mentality.
Somebody said as well, Mick Ferranti stated in my book, something very interesting, is that the DJ who brings the records that nobody has heard of before, or people worship as being some of the best music in the world, looks a bit like a priest on his altar, basically. Um, I personally, when I DJ'd a few years ago, took it very seriously and realized that the role of a DJ is a bit of the role of a shaman. Basically, you get people in trance, by the sounds you're playing to them. And it's a tradition that must be going back to maybe 30,000 years ago, when people used to gather maybe in caves and play some kind of tam tam music, and that was whole. And to this day, it's the same thing. It's all about finding a companion, finding for men to find a woman, and to start a family. And the only way, and that's something that existed thousands of years ago, was to gather at night, probably take some mushrooms or something to get in a certain state, so that you would be more sensitive to the music, start dancing, find yourself the woman of your dreams, or whatever you can find from the tribe or the other tribe, whatever, and start basically create a family like that. And that's something that existed, I'm pretty sure, tens of thousands of years ago, which is still the same thing to this day. People go clubbing because they are alone, because they need to find somebody. Once they found their wife for life, they don't go out anymore. They don't need to. That's a way what killed the mod scene, and also probably the punk scene or the rockabilly scene during the 80s, 90s. It's that once you settled, you don't need that anymore. Only a few guys carried on going out, and but the scene, like in the 60s, was first of all a certain generation that faded away and was replaced by another generation that faded away and was replaced by another one. Today you can find some kids, 17, 16 years old, who are adhering to that scene. Now that would lead me to another subject, which is who is a mod really, who is really a mod, who is not. It's not only the look that decides over that. It's the mentality. It's a bit like at this point, come like a political movement. I could say from personal experience, I've met many communists, but did I meet one real communist out of the lot? It's difficult to say. When I was a student in art in Paris back in the early 90s, my head teacher, the headmaster, hated me because I was a hard mod, nearly skinhead, and he couldn't admit that. And he was a lefty with long hair, and he was listening to Genesis and all these creeps. But I realized that this guy was 10 times more of a fascist than me, because he couldn't admit me. I could admit him, but he couldn't admit me. So who is the mod, who is the fascist, who is the, in all that. So it's like every scene you've got out of the lot of people you see over there. It's not always the best dressed up, the best looking guy that is the real Monty. It's most of the time question of mentality more than a question of look. Now, what is the modernist mentality? That's very hard to define. In my second book, I've got a title saying that the mods were the punks of the 60s, because we have the tendency to separate each movement. But actually, when you look at it, it's an evolution that started at the end of World War II, with the Beat Generation in the 50s in America. Then came the mod movement and the mod revolution in the 60s. Then it ended up with the hippie revolution, and then it couldn't be all that to make society understand that the youth had a voice. Before that, the youth didn't have a voice. You didn't have the concept of teenagers. You were either a kid or a man, and you didn't have any middle point. So the 50s, 60s, 70s tended to prove that there was a middle class, let's say, of in terms of age, and then they wanted to be heard. So we could see that actually it's not three different movements, but it's one evolution that started with a failure, and they were not recognized, and then came 68, and they were still not recognized, and then came 77, and that's probably the last revolution in terms of music, and we could say a youth revolution that was saying that's it, now we exist, we want to be heard. And if you take people like Joe Strummer and go back in time in 70, 71, he had hair that long and he was hanging around in Carnaby Street in the middle of swinging London. Same with the Jam. I've got a photo, quite compromising photo, which shows them back in 74, 75 when they started to gather and rehearse, and all of them had hair that long, including Paul Weller. And all that was cut off very quickly in 76, 77, because the fashion that punk created was a counter effect, to the prog rock explosion, a bit like the skinheads were a counter effect to the hippie explosion. But all in all, it's actually one line, I suppose, that ended up in 77, and unfortunately there hasn't been any revolution since then, neither any new sound. I don't take the techno explosion of the 90s as really something new. I think it's basically new wave getting to the end of the road.
So it seems like we go in cycles over and over and over again.
No, I mean, yeah, we have to go in cycles because we don't have any choice. I think there is a beginning and an end, and that's one line. Starting in the late 40s, ending up in the mid 70s, late 70s. And after that, yeah, it's a replay of the past. Because I noticed the first appearance for a kind of revival, an interest for the past, started in fashion around 78. And if you look at France, because France takes usually 2 to 3 years to adapt to the rhythm of England. France is looking at England since the Beatles, like the mecca for music, fashion, and now art, actually. But you could see clearly back in the early 80s. I was 11, 12 in 1980. My brother, 12 years older than me, I remember him coming back home one day looking basically like a gentleman of the mid 50s. The haircut, the glasses, the Wayfarer, Ray-Ban Wayfarer were coming back in fashion, but that was something issued from the 50s. Certain type of coats, were basically 50s fashion. So there was a revival of the 50s, probably starting as early as 75 in England with the Teddy Boys revival. Punk was also a way to look back at the 3-minute single, because everybody had enough of this prog rock bands that were playing for half an hour the same song. So it came back to an earlier rock and roll concept, which was the short song. But from 78, and that's when Colophenia was filmed and then released, 78, 79, that's when you can see people adhering, going back straight away to an older fashion. Either they would become 50s influence, like the Rockabillys, 60s influence, like the Mods, and now it's basically you're either influenced by one or the other. But I don't think that since 77, 79, in terms of rock, pure rock, there has been any new sound. You know, whatever you hear now from what they call indie music or punk influenced music is the same than 77, 78. It's not bringing anything new, and it's terrible. It looks like basically we are prisoners of a loop now. Same thing in cinema. And there is a bigger market for the remakes nowadays than for new ideas. You know, Hollywood will be more interested in investing into, let's say, we're gonna do Psycho again, Psycho from Hitchcock, you know, than trying to do something new that has never been done before. Because we know that when the market already exists, it's much easier to sell. For instance, same with the covers, you know, the cover songs. Take a good old track from the 60s, put it back onto the charts nowadays with a few arrangements and a bit of a difference, that will go straight to the charts because people in general, I've noticed that as a DJ myself, you've got very few of us who are only interested in something they've never heard of before. When I go to a club, a mod night, I want to hear some stuff that I've never heard before. That's why I go there. But 90%, 80% of the people will only dance on the stuff that they already know. So I remember, you know, doing clubs on nights in London with average indie people and not mods, and only playing them covers, covers of the Rolling Stones, covers of the Beatles, and people would go and jump on the dance floor because they could recognize that song.
So I think what you're saying is that people are very afraid of doing something completely new nowadays. And if they do something new, it's something that's already designated, something that already is fashionable. It's nothing really new. It's nothing that's not breaking the scene anymore.
Yeah, and mod is actually about discovering. It's not about playing the same old tunes all the time. That's the problem I found, you know, in that scene. Is basically you got DJs who come with lovely collections of records and so on, but they will have to play always the same tracks in order to get the people dancing. Because if they play stuff that you never heard of before, even if it's fantastic, it's gonna bring a certain amount of people on the dance floor, which I consider myself the real mods, because they are there to discover. You're there to discover sounds. You're not there to always dance or always listen to the same music. So you find that in general in the population. You know, it's basically they only dance. They only get transported, shall we say, by things that they already heard, that they already knew. And that's something I don't find mod at all. You know, it's quite boring.
Do you think this is why maybe the skinheads broke away a bit from the mods? Is because you had this amazing culture come out of the mods, but then it became a fashion, and so the skinheads they were fed up with this,
Yep.
and much like the punks, you
Yep.
know, they were true rebels, but it becomes so much of a fashion, you get people breaking away.
And
from
they
it
brought
again.
and they brought a new sound. They brought the Jamaican sound that existed already and was fairly lessened by mods in the early 60s to mid 60s. But that was, you know, basically when you go to a mod club nowadays and they try to recreate what it was in the early mid 60s, you will always have in the middle of a set a little 3, 4, 5 ska songs. So, you know, the mods used to dance on that, but not only on that. What the skinheads did, basically, they took ska and rocksteady at the time and said, this is our music now. Besides, they were most of the time coming from a very, not a poor background, but let's say most of them were coming from estates. They were from the working class, working class families. So they were constantly sharing their environment with West Indian guys, who had arrived shortly after '63, and therefore they mixed with them. The original skinhead is absolutely not a racist movement. On the contrary, You could count as many black men as many whites in the original skinheads of 68, 69.
Is this where the specials came and
That's much later.
Is that much later?
Much later, yeah. Basically, the skinheads became nationalists, and that's why they were associated with racism, which is completely wrong, because nationalism means proud of being English. Doesn't mean that you want every foreigners out. Yeah. So throughout the 70s, it evolved, unfortunately, into two kind of directions. One was, yeah, I'm listening to black music and almost I wish I was black, and the other one was, no, we want our country for ourselves and we want it clean, and therefore the music started to change. That's when Oi music, derived from punk, started to develop, and that's when the specials arrived, saying, no, we have to stay black and white. That's why they created two tone, and said, well, we want a right mix of black and white musicians. We want a mix of black and white culture, which was already approached in the late 60s by bands like the Foundations and others were kind of offering, trying to have as many black musicians as white musicians in the band. As something that was created, I would say, back in 62, 63 with Booker T and the MGs in America. You had black drummer, Booker T at the keyboard, but you had a white bass player and a white guitarist. And that's originated basically in Memphis, where there was so much segregation that some white people said, we had enough of that. We want to mix with these people. We want to work with these people. And that's why Booker T and the MGs were created, to show that it was possible to have a mixed band. And as I said, it carried on. It tried to develop in the late 60s, early 70s. But then it split completely. So you had on one side the funk bands, which was properly black music and nothing else, and on the other end, the prog rock, which was just white music and nothing else. Only in the north of the country, in the industrial areas, was something that was to be called Northern Soul, much later, which was basically working class clubs where black music was still played throughout the 70s. And that's where you see also the first kind of schism between the north and the south of England, which I explain in one of my books, led to massive fights during the first rallies organized in the early 80s, because you had scooterists coming from the north of England clashing with the mods of London, up to a point that there was a massive riot in Southend, I think in 80 or 81, I have to check. And Southend banned the rallies, scooter rallies, until probably not even 10 years ago. So it was impossible to have a scooter rally in Southend after 81. Because of that, the fight between northern mods and southern mods. It's something that was about to occur anyway between two different types of working class and middle class, basically. It's funny to see the difference in music from one side of the country to the other. It appeared already, as I said, in the early 70s, when the north of England was mainly listening to soul music, carrying on, that tradition coming from America, and the south of England, which had developed the best prog rock bands of their generation, like Pink Floyd, Genesis, but in a way they were all coming from middle class background, and you can see it in the way they behave. You can feel it probably in their music. So that's when the big difference started to appear inside this country between north and south. another thing, another point I wanted to approach is what I call the working class element. Um, Although the first mods were most likely to be from a middle class background, it was in the 60s and even to this day an approach mainly done by working class kids. And I remember one of my interviews with Milton Astley saying to me that he used to arrive at work better dressed than his own boss. Um, and
Who is he? Who's
Milton Astley is a guy I interviewed in my second book. One of the young faces I got to meet in the late 90s. Um, Actually, I'll show you. I've got a photo in by Rebecca Louise, but never mind. He, he said that to me one day. He was better dressed than his boss, although he was just on small wages, on minimal wages. But the working class element, I would say, is important because it's the only way to really understand what it is and how important it is for a mod to have this kind of look, to be able, to spend all his wages on one suit because he's gonna look better than anybody else. And one day I remember we were trying to define that with Des Manet, and I said, for me, it's basically the only way for somebody who is working class to become upper class without going through the middle stage of middle class, because the values of middle class are actually quite nefast, I would say. They're quite negative. They're all based about money and status. If you jump from working class to upper class, you avoid all these wrong influences, I would say, that you develop in the middle class. You jump above it, basically. Um, how could I explain that? Um, as I say, the values of the middle class are in my opinion quite negative. It's all about social status. So when you're born with working class in this country, you will die working class. And if you're born upper class, you will die upper class. But what the middle class have been trying to do for centuries is to get to the upper class level, which I think is the reason for a lot of problems in today's society. And I can see that mainly in France more than in England. France had a revolution 200 years ago, and that gave the possibility to people to improve their status, and to the point it becomes an obsession to some of them, and that is seriously insane. That to me very much the poison of a society.
I think the middle class have a lot to prove,
Yeah.
whereas the working class, they don't give a shit.
No.
Where the middle class are also afraid of looking bad or losing everything. So if you jump from working class to rich, well,
Not rich, but upper class.
Upper class
doesn't mean rich. You can be upper class and have no castle, have lost it all, basically. But you've got an education, you've got a way of standing, a way of posing, which makes you stand out of the crowd. Something very interesting that Pete Townsend used to say in one of his interviews back in the 60s. One mod in the middle of the crowd, you wouldn't recognize him, because the fashion was the same for everybody, but the mods used that fashion and twisted it a bit in order to be original. Now he said two mods in the crowd can recognize themselves straight away as a kind of, as I say, the secret society, a kind of sect, basically. Today, of course, is completely different. But the problem is today it's become more of a look than an attitude. Like, for instance, a few months ago, I was at the local pub over there, and there was some Spanish kids who were applying for a job, and one of them had the proper skinhead look. So I approached them and said, "Well, you look the business. You've got the proper. Are you a skinhead?" Yeah, he said, "No, no. I saw that in a magazine. I fancied it, and that's why I dressed like that." Didn't have any clue what it meant or where it's coming from. He just find that funny, he find that interesting, and he dresses like that. But the guy doesn't have any knowledge in music, knowledge in history, nothing. And that's what we get now, basically. People buying into the look and not giving a shit about anything else. And you had guys who died in the 70s during riots to protect their identity, to protect their personality, to say, I'm like that because it's a choice, because to find that today, some people, dresses, buy into the look just because they fancy it and they don't give a shit about what it means. I find that quite sad, to be honest. But that's nowadays panorama. I was saying, contrary to what a lot of people say in this country, I don't believe that the original mods were really a British phenomenon. I've got a movie called Les Tricheurs, The Cheaters. That was released, I think, in 58, 59. And it shows basically young students in Paris riding scooters, but that was quite a common thing back then, wearing American parkas and listening to modern jazz, because in 56, 58 jazz evolved, became much more modern, changed completely from its traditional sound that was the same since the late 40s. And the appearance of people like Art Tatum, Miles Davis, made jazz evolve very quickly to a new kind of sound, much cooler, much more atmospheric, still impregnated with a bit of rock and roll. That's how you would dance on it back then. But in Les Tricheurs, in that French movie, I find the name. I find I forgot who did it exactly, but I'm pretty sure it was shown in England, in London, as part of European cinema, and a few kids were not very happy with the rock and roll explosion that dated from 55 and was running out of steam back then. Discovered an American jazz that gave the name to them, the modernists, which came as a reaction against, not against rock and roll, but against the popularity of the music and how the media were trying to control all that. But basically, rock and roll was pretty much a white version of rhythm and blues. Rhythm and blues was quite obscure and difficult to find. It wasn't something you could find easily at your local record shop, and it came much later in England. So I would say the modernists started in England with a bunch of Jewish tailors' sons, apparently, that's the legend, who were into modern jazz, and it developed as a kind of new wave, opposed to the stagnation of rock and roll. Although, if you look at it, they both share the same root, which is rhythm and blues. Maybe I'm getting a bit, or getting you lost in
Action.
Okay. So, the first one to come out, really, 2004, was this one. It was like, I don't know, the first time somebody was putting a book only about this sort of time, the revival of the 80s. Then it got translated 2 years later, luckily enough, in Japanese, more or less, well, the same thing, but smaller photos, but better quality paper though. Normally I should have had some color in it. I was gutted. My publisher didn't want to put the money in it. That's the second one to come in 2010, which was really my work. That's where I am involved, where I was part of it. It's a photo I did personally. And 2012, after my publisher died, unfortunately of leukemia, Helter Skelter abandoned the project, and I got the rights back, and I could republish and correct the first one, which is, in my opinion, a better cover for the color scheme. In parallel, I used to every year put out a calendar, which was really a good idea in terms of promoting the photographers that were involved, and I did that until 2013. I don't know why I stopped, but probably running out of photos. What is interesting about the photos gives you a fairly good idea of how the scene did evolve. Like, for instance, you can see there all this psychedelic, shirts and all that, the mustaches, the sideburns. All that is very much involved by the late 60s, and that's the 90s scene. The 90s recreated the second half of the mod thing, which was going from smart tonic suit and short hair to longer hair and psychedelic shirts and all that. Scooters stayed the same, obviously, but there you can see the difference between, for instance, this is 1985, a photo by Paula Lam, where everybody is wearing a suit and even got into buying, 60s expensive cars when they had enough of scooters, and you have to evolve from the scooters. The pork pie hat, one of the best features, coming from the ska and Jamaican influence, but worn a lot by the mods. And there you see a photo interesting. It's 1982 in Brighton, and there is less work put on the scooters. They're just wearing parkas. There is not so much attention about the look. Fred Perry and a pair of jeans was enough at the time. But the casual look later in the 80s was much more stylish. It involved skiing jumpers and stuff like that. And of course, always this art of posing next to the scooter, because each scooter is different from the other, as you can see. And that's when it's quite controversial when you think of the mod thing. It's a scene where everybody wants to be part of a gang, part of a cult, but everybody has to look different. It's not about looking the same than the others. I'm not like everybody else, as the Kings used to say.
Action.
Yeah, to come back to where we were before, as Desmanet was one of the first persons I interviewed for my volume 1, and he contributed a lot to this book. And he said to me something very important one day when I interviewed him. Contrary to what happened in the 60s, in the 80s, the mod movement started as a very commercialized fashion, thanks to the movie Quadrophenia. So thousands of kids in 79, 80 started to dress mod, but they were not really having a clue about what it was. And then during the 80s, and then it became much more specialized into the gear, into the clothes, and it became much more smarter and more interesting. When actually in the 60s it was the opposite. It started as a very elitist group and became much more commercialized throughout the early 60s. something that so I've always kept two models with me. One day or the other we'll go back on the road. But when? I don't know. So I started with Vespa. Vespa, I mean, was the thing that you could afford as a teenager. I paid 50 quid for my first Vespa. I paid 40 quid for this one back in 1994. I was a friend of mine.